Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. We're hosting this episode on a Monday morning. Some really sad news obviously across the weekend. The passing of Sir Bobby Charlton that emerged on Saturday, aged 86. An absolute legend of the club, a stalwart, an English great. And the club paid their respects on Saturday against Sheffield United by wearing black armbands and laying a wreath before the game. My colleagues Tyrone Marshall and Samuel Luckhurst were at Bramall Lane. Samuel, terribly sad news, a remarkable man, a remarkable life. He was a genuine great, wasn't he?
He was a legend who stopped the other greats in their stride. It always stands out that when they last won the Champions League, I mean, he led the team up as the club dignitary, which was particularly poignant 50 years after the Munich air disaster, 40 years after they first won the European Cup. And when he receives this, I think it was like a shield or something off Michel Platini, who was the UEFA president at the time, and then the players follow up and Ronaldo's one of the first, and Ronaldo notices Bobby Charlton and embraces him and shares a moment with him, and everyone knows the ego quite justifiably that he has Ronaldo, but even he was stopped in his tracks by Sir Bobby Charlton in that moment. And I went down to Old Trafford yesterday morning. I was asked on to do some TV, but it was quite, heartwarming to see a lot of children accompanying their parents, grandparents with grandchildren as well, and then educating them about this great man whose name will be remembered for many more generations. Because everywhere you look at Old Trafford, he's had a huge role in whatever it is you clap your eyes on, whether it's the size on the stadium, because he was absolutely instrumental in Manchester United becoming the worldwide phenomenon that they are. He's got a stand named after him. He's one of, I think, 5 or 6 greats in the club's history who's immortalised with a statue. The Munich clock as well, of course, is very poignant. The plaque to the Munich air disaster, the Munich tunnel. Even Sir Alex Ferguson, Bobby Charlton was a huge supporter of his in those early years, those difficult years. And I think it's in the MEN's archive, these great pictures of them coming back on the train after the FA Cup final in 1990. And of course, that was what kick-started United's era of dominance. And Ferguson is clearly jubilant on the train, but the other one who looks particularly revelling in the celebrations is Bobby Charlton. And he was quite a restrained man. When the stand was named in his honour, he looked almost bashful about it. But there were certain moments, and that FA Cup win was one of them, but the other ones were when United won the European Cup, because he knew how important that was to United and United's identity, and how special it was after Busby blazing a trail, taking the team into Europe in 1956, and the tragedy, and Charlton being pulled from the wreckage in the slushy snow of Munich by Harry Gregg, and then recovering to win it 10 years later. And that is what's particularly remarkable. He somehow, let's face it, he'd have suffered from PTSD before everybody knew what PTSD was after Munich, and I think there was an element of survivor's guilt that he felt, which just accentuates the sadness about that. But then to have condensed, an FA Cup, 2 league titles, Ballon d'Or, European Cup, World Cup within a decade is just breathtaking. It's absolutely extraordinary. Henry Winter wrote, I think it might have been last year or a couple of years ago, a piece on why he was England's greatest sports person, and I think for that alone you can't argue with it. And it's going to be a very emotional time for United. I mean, they've got 3 home games coming up. The first one's in the Champions League, European nights. That's what Charlton was synonymous with. Then there's the derby as well, and it's quite eerie that 2 members of the 2 Manchester clubs, Holy Trinities, Bobby Charlton and Francis Lee, have passed away quite close together. And then with Newcastle coming to town, I mean, he grew up a Newcastle fan, and he was related, a distant relative of Jackie Milburn's. And I think those in Manchester, they are up in the northeast, they're probably as proud of Bobby Charlton as United fans are of him.
The words icon and legend are just thrown around these days, Tyrone. Bobby Charlton, Sir Bobby Charlton generally wasn't he? His achievements, like I say, the word remarkable is probably fair to describe them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think Ten Hag said before the game he was a giant, and I think that's a pretty apt description. I saw someone on Twitter say if every club could only have one legend, then United's would be Sir Bobby Charlton. He is undoubtedly, I think, the most important, the most significant person in the club's history. He's a link to the past, to the darkest hours, and to the present, really. I mean, he was a director for 39 years. He was still a regular at games. Before his diagnosis with dementia in 2020, he was still a regular in games. And clearly just a huge figure around the club, a support to players and staff, even long after his own playing days had ended. I spoke to Diego Dallo in the mix zone after the game at the weekend, and it was quite good that United put someone up who had met him, because probably half of that squad probably hadn't met him, really. The ones who signed after 2020 would have had nothing to do with him, really. They'd know the mythology and the stories and the legend. But Dallo spoke about how even when he signed in June 2018, and when he first signed, he said Charlton would be there after every home game at least, and in the dressing room, win or lose, talking to the players. And he was clearly he was still present around United at that time, long after his own playing career had ended. And undoubtedly a giant, a legend, every word you can use, really. He was the most significant person in the history of that football club, I think. And it is an emotional time. It was always going to be an emotional time on Saturday when it broke in the afternoon. A difficult time, really, when it breaks at short notice to do it justice at an away game. But I think both sets of fans and both clubs got it right. And I'm sure, like Samuel says, on Tuesday night, certainly, I think it'll be very emotional on Tuesday night against FC Copenhagen in what is United's first home game after the news.
Obviously, flowers and scarves has been laid at the Holy Trinity. Samuel, as you said, you went down to Old Trafford yesterday. Supporters have been invited to come pay their respects. Could you paint a scene of what that was like when you visited yesterday? What was the atmosphere like around the ground?
Yeah, it was. I can't remember the last time I went there, if I've ever been there actually on a Sunday off, but I was there at about midday, and fortunately it was quite a nice day yesterday, so it wasn't as if the weather was a deterrent, but it was still quiet at that point. I did a lap of the stadium because I had my little boy with me and he was asleep, so I think if you know in parenting that if you want to keep a kid asleep, it's best to keep them in motion. But I did a lap of the stadium, and there wasn't a queue at that point for the Book of Condolence, but it looked like there was later on, looking at the Sky News footage. But there was one lady who came by and she had a wreath. I think most people had floral tributes, it was a bunch of flowers, but she had a wreath. And Pete Stevenson, I was speaking to from Sky Sports News, he asked if he could just speak to her quickly, and she had no problem. And he said, "Were you up all night making that?" And she said, "Yes, I was." And she was clearly a lady who had the privilege of watching Charlton, and a lot of the regalia that was being worn by certain supporters, they were, it was of that era. It was retro shirts. It was things to do with the Munich air disaster. And he clearly meant an awful lot to these people, and these are the people that you want to hear from, really. I mean, at the risk of turning people away from reading our work, none of us were able to watch him, and the closest we got to him was kind of like sitting, I don't know, a couple of dozen feet away from him when he was in the director's box at Old Trafford. And occasionally, if you're waiting in a mix zone, he would walk by, because the dressing room tended to be quite near. But some of my colleagues had the privilege of interviewing him, and you want to read what Brian Glanville or Hunter Davies, these great writers who not only watched him and watched him a hell of a lot, but knew him quite well, what they had to say about him. Sadly, people from that generation, there aren't many of them left now, and I think that's one of the sad aspects about Charlton's death, is that growing up, these football gods of a certain era, there aren't many of them left. Pele, Best, Cruyff, Maradona, Eusebio. That is quite a, I know the mortality maths, everyone's aware of it, but it's still, there is a bit of a shock element that comes to it. On Saturday, I'd got wind at probably midday that someone had suggested to me that he'd passed away, and United had previously stressed there was a rumour floating about, and they said it was just rumour. So when these things happen, you always hope it's just rumour. But when we were in the car going to Sheffield, it flashed up on my screen a message in our WhatsApp group from someone at United, and we both knew, because of the identity of the staff member who was sending the message, that he was about to be the bearer of bad news. So it will be interesting to see how United pay their respects, because when George Best died, and I think in terms of players who've played for United, a lot would argue that Best was the greater footballer, because he was just, his talent was genius, and Bobby Charlton was a genius as well. You could argue Best was the greater footballer and Charlton was the greater player. And when Best died in 2005, I think there was more of a tragic element to it, because he was so young, and the alcoholism and that final picture of him in hospital. And there must have been at least 3 games where there was some kind of remembrance or commemoration, and you would imagine that because United have got this run of home games, and also the opponents as well, it does kind of lend itself to have these very dignified tributes. And we've seen before with United and City that they've come together when it was the Munich air disaster's 50th anniversary in 2008, and as I said, that was very, very dignified. There was a lot of there was some concern that City fans would ruin it, but that wasn't the case on the day whatsoever. And as these very it was a great idea. I think it was a fan on a forum who, I think it was a Red Issue forum at the time, who suggested that they wear a retro kit, and United actually took that on board. And obviously Bobby Charlton was there that day, and I suppose that's another element of it in terms of the Munich air disaster. I'm not too. I think it's easy to fixate on the '66 team, because that's the great triumph in English football. But from what happened in 1958 in Munich, I'm not too sure anyone who's on that plane now is living. I'm trying to wrap my brains, but Harry Gregg died a few years ago, and yeah, it's sad. But he, after being a whisker away from death, he had an incredibly fulfilling life. And listening to some of the archive stuff, people in Ashington were telling him or talking about Bobby Charlton being destined for playing for England from the age of about 7 or 8. It was Jack, and this was Jack who was saying it as well. He had to work a bit harder, but Bobby Charlton was the one who that they all knew from a particularly precocious age he was destined for greatness, and he really was a great.
He's a figure who transcended the sport, and you said, Samuel, yesterday that your parents would go on holiday. His name was just universally recognised. Everyone would know Sir Bobby Charlton, his name, if you spoke to people. In terms of the game itself then, Ty, obviously Sheffield United on Saturday evening. Scott McTominay said before the game that we need to do it for Sir Bobby. He scored the opening goal. Diego Dallo's goal was an excellent effort on 25 yards, stunning strike. It was a fitting tribute to Sir Bobby in that regard, wasn't it? To the scorers to score like that. Yeah,
the identity of the goal scorers were apt. Certainly an academy graduate who's been at the club for, Scott McTominay's 26, has been associated with Man United for 21 years of those 26. So that was undoubtedly fitting. And the same with Dallo, where, like I say, a player who Charlton had met, and looking at them once a right back, you wouldn't say there's much in that image, but the goal was certainly reminiscent of one Charlton would score. It didn't have kind of the marauding run that we so often see of Charlton. When you watch the YouTube highlights of his goals, so many of those accelerations from midfield and long distance strikes, but the quality of it was similar. And you wouldn't say it was a performance that was fitting of it in terms of style, but the substance of it was. As good a player as Charlton was, you read about it, there's no doubt he was a fighter and a scrapper as well, and was incredibly determined and as Samuel has touched on, to show grit. And United did at least do that on Saturday. It was a very hard working and determined performance. They had to ride their luck a little bit in the first half, and it wasn't. And Dallo touched on it afterwards. They knew what it was going to be like, and he was saying he'd never played there before, but knew what the atmosphere was going to be like. And Dallo called it a very English game. And when it gets like that on a Saturday night, a ground like that, you're going to have to really dig in and probably take a few blows to get the victory, and that's what they did.
We'll just leave it there for part one then. We'll be back in with it for part two. Welcome back to part two of the Manchester is Red podcast. We're going to look at the performance in a bit more detail on Samuel. Tyrone said it was a scrappy performance, and look, it was a really important 3 points, back-to-back league wins after the international break. Obviously Brentford and Sheffield United now, they needed to use that momentum for 3 points, but it was unconvincing, wasn't it? And you look at the wins this season, Wolves, Nottingham Forest,
all by
Burnley,
one goal,
Brentford, Sheffield United, all by 1 goal. And all of those teams are going to be at the bottom of the table, aren't they? And surely that's a bit alarming.
None of those wins have been convincing. I think maybe on Saturday that was the most encouraging in a way, in that in the second half it felt like a goal was coming. I never got the sense that a winning goal was going to be elusive, even when Rashford pulled a shot just wide and Amrabat hit the woodwork. And when those things happen, you can wonder if is it not going to be United's night? But it always felt like it was inevitable they were going to get a winning goal. I think Sheffield United's legs went very, very quickly in the second half. McBurney coming off, they really missed. I mean, Harry Maguire got man of the match. I think that was just because some stats flashed up, and we didn't have. They didn't flash up on our monitor. And it's almost as if Alan Smith, who's the co-commentator, because he's a former England international, it seems like a lot of England internationals, past and present, they've no time for criticism of Harry Maguire. And I'm not saying he played badly, but I was, in terms of the ratings, it was impossible to pick out someone who was the absolute standout. There wasn't an 8 out of 10 performance. There was some. I mean, Dalot was not having a good game, but he was elevated 7 out of 10 just because of the winning goal, although I still think Foderingham could have kept that out. A better goalkeeper would have saved that. He wasn't too convincing for the first goal either. He got wrong-footed by McTominay's shot. We all assumed it had deflected, but it hadn't. But I suppose it's encouraging for United that they had that control and the goal was coming, and so it's felt a while since United played that way in a game, and there was an inevitability about them winning it as well. But there were too many aspects of the performance which were in keeping with the form this season, and they've got a long, long way to go if that Brentford game is to still be a turning point. I think they've got to win both their games this week, which is a tall order. There's a lot of pressure on them in Europe, and of course it's pretty much the best team in the world who are turning up at Old Trafford on Sunday. And in terms of the issues with that performance, again, conceding a goal within 6 minutes, which has happened 6 times now this season, they can't eradicate that. I thought they were far too meek with Jules. The use of the ball was sloppy and aimless.
Sloppy's being kind, I think.
Yeah. Højlund, I felt sorry for him at times. I think if the Sky stats were appearing, I was waiting for them to show how many touches he'd had in the first half hour, because it must have been comfortably in single figures and low single figures, because he was just not getting any service and there was no link-up play. They got a little bit better in the last 10 minutes of the first half, but as a friend messaged during that first 45 minutes, he said, which is the promoted team here? And some of the selections again from Ten Hag. Okay, McTominay got the goal. He had quite an eventful first half in that he got the goal and he gave away a penalty. Other than that, not a lot to write home about. Anthony, I've never had Anthony, and I'm still not having Anthony. It's pretty extraordinary when you think that he started 5 Premier League games this season, and Garnacho has still not started a league game since Tottenham away in August, and Garnacho was a positive. He came on, did well. Eriksen came on and did well. I thought the substitutions really did have a good impact against they did against Brentford. But I think another troubling aspect of it, I think it was in the 14th minute when Onana went down, and when we were driving back, we were even wondering, was he actually injured? Was he just doing it for attack? Because Ten Hag literally beckoned, and some of the players thought it was just like the attackers, it was just the midfielders. No, he wanted literally all 10 outfield players over and to tell them something very, very clearly. And Solskjaer said last month, it was a lot easier coaching them when it was behind closed doors. And some of those players are still there. A lot of those players are not there as well. But it's not surprising United seem to have this issue. And watching Ten Hag in the first half, Anthony clearly was not listening to him. He was trying to get him further forward, because if he's in midfield getting the ball, he's useless. I mean, he's not particularly useful anyway, but he kills attacks because he's one-paced, he's one-dimensional. He's not going to get away from his marker. He's just going to run down the line and the ball's going to go out for a throw-in, or he's going to get tackled. And Ten Hag was even telling Dalot, look, move a bit higher up, so he's a bit further up there. And it just didn't get through to Anthony whatsoever. And this is a player who worked with Ten Hag for 2 seasons at Ajax. He's had a season with him at United. And the message is still not getting through. And the message wasn't getting through to others, to the point that he was having to call literally every outfield player over. The game wasn't even a quarter of an hour old at that point. So there are still fundamental issues with United, and there are certain players whose form this season, I mean, Fernandes got, because he's the captain and because he gives his all, he had his name chanted at full time. But his form this season has been desperate, really, really bad. Rashford was a little bit better, but he's still out of form. Højlund, what you see is what you get. I don't think any of us are surprised that he's still not got a Premier League goal this season. As I said with Anthony, I'm just not having him. And already with Mason Mount, we've talked about what a mountain to climb, pun intended there, it is already for him. It's understandably because of the news with Sir Bobby Charlton, the team news wasn't as major, but he's already been dropped. He's been omitted from the England squad and he's been dropped already. That's what happens when you go to Man United. To a lot of players, it feels like, and it always feels as though he's that curse of the number 7 has afflicted him. But he couldn't have any complaints. I think we discussed on Friday. I wouldn't have started Anthony just because I don't rate him really, and that was my rationale for starting Mount. But Mount couldn't have any complaints for not starting that game because he was appalling against Brentford as well. And I suppose it's got to be a worry for Ten Hag that, again, if you're looking at the standout performers in a game like that, you're looking at, I thought Johnny Evans did quite well again, and Maguire got man of the match. And again, you're talking about Claude Puel's first choice partnership from 5 years ago. And even that was weird, Varane not starting. We were told by a staff member at United, which was clearly, this was very PR, I think, like if he had 2 more days rest, he'd have started against Brentford. Well, he's had nearly 3 weeks rest now, and he didn't even start at the weekend. So what's going on there? And even after the game, it was weird. There were five questions into the post-match press conference where they've just won a game, and then it was, right, we'll end it there. Fantastic, you've just won a game. There were more questions after they got thrashed 7-0 by Liverpool at Anfield. So although there's been an international break and normally they offer a chance for a reset, there are still an awful lot of elements on and off the pitch which are pretty worrying if you're a United fan or if you're a journalist covering United.
There's lots of players in that team who are underperforming, that's obvious. But when I'm watching United at the moment, they don't look like a well-coached team. I'm trying to see what are the patterns of play, what are they trying to do? And we discussed how the midfield was there on the preview podcast. Amrabat started with McTominay, Fernandes. They were absolutely anonymous in that first half. Obviously, they did improve in the second half and they had more control in the last 25-30 minutes. It was brutal tie in that first half. They couldn't keep the ball. They didn't know what to do with it. The defence was getting it. They were lumping it up. It wasn't sticking. And Sheffield United looked like the better team. And Manchester United can't be level with Sheffield United, who have just came up from the Championship. I'm scratching my head at the moment. I can't see what he's trying to do.
No, I know. And the strange thing is that last season they did look a well-coached team. But last season they were reliant on, they were strong defensively, they were well organised, and they relied on some Rashford magic to win games. He scored 30 goals last season. He was, him and Fernandes were key to breaking defences down, and United, especially at Old Trafford, would keep a clean sheet. And I've been saying since pre-season, it is very obvious that Ten Hag has tried to make this team more attacking and more in the mould of his Ajax this year. They're playing a much higher line. They're trying to get more men forward. They're trying to dominate games to the extent Ajax did, but they're not good enough to do it. Ajax can dominate Eredivisie games. I mean, probably a bad example at the moment, given what's happening to them.
It feels like that build-up play is very rushed, so they're trying to transition. He said he wants it to be a brilliant transition team, and they're getting that ball, and it seems like they're moving it too quickly. Well, take a moment, settle it, retain possession, and move up the pitch.
Fernandes treated the ball like it was going to explode on Saturday. He would get it and
does that a lot
just
as well.
launch it. Yeah, and the quality of the long distance passing, apart from Harry Maguire. I mean, Maguire was the best passer in the team on Saturday. His long passing, especially, there was a few that were pretty accurate. Fernandes's were all over the place. And yeah, they do just look a poor team. And touched on Anthony there. You know, the reason he was good in Holland was because the first time he would have contact with the ball would be in the final third, in the attacking third. And we've seen that. You look at all his goals last season, and they're either he gets the ball in the inside right channel, 20, 25 yards from goal, cuts in, curls in a great finish, or he gets it running into the area on a counter-attack. In this United team, he gets it on halfway. And as Samuel said, he hasn't got the pace. He's not a winger who's going to beat a man, which doesn't have to be problematic. A lot of wingers these days aren't necessarily going to beat a man, but they get the ball in dangerous areas. If Rashford gets the ball on halfway, you know he can carry it forward. Look at where he got the ball for his goal for England in midweek. It was good work from Jude Bellingham, but in amidst all the praise to Bellingham, it was kind of forgotten that Rashford did get the ball 30, 35 yards from goal and finished 18 yards out, maybe less than that. Anthony just can't do that. He can't carry the ball. He's not a dribbler. He's not a ball carrier. So he needs to get on the ball in the final third. But United can't get there. And I think Ten Hag has clearly tried to make this team more aggressive, more pressing this year. But it's taken them backwards. They've lost the fundamentals of being strong defensively and well organised. And it is just not working at the moment. It doesn't. It can be hard to distinguish between cause and effect. Like, are Rashford and Casemiro as probably the two most obvious examples, maybe Fernandes as well, but say Rashford and Casemiro. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they were certainly in the top three for Player of the Year last year, I would say. I think the official vote had Casemiro down in fourth maybe, but I think we would all put them top three, probably top two. I think they were probably the two most important players for United's success last year. One got 30 goals. One was a world-class transformative player in a position United haven't had strength in for years. And this year, their standards are way, way below that. But are United struggling because they've fallen off a cliff? Or are they struggling because United have fallen off a cliff? It can be hard to distinguish between.
I mean, even with those caveats, though, they should be performing better than scraping these wins against these lowly oppositions, these poor sides.
I don't think anyone expects them to, though. That's the problem. I don't think any of us expected United to go there and thump Sheffield United. It played out as we expected. I think all of us thought they would win, but not win convincingly.
But that's not good enough. It's not a shock. No, it's not good enough, is it? That's the thing.
No, it isn't.
They are, isn't it, in mid-table?
No.
I mean, you look at the teams that played 3 of the top 8 from last season: Tottenham, Arsenal, and Brighton. They've lost all 3 games. Manchester City next, so that could be potentially 4 defeats from 4 games against last season's top 8. And the struggle against those sides, it's not looking good for the forecast for the rest of the season for as far as Champions League goes. The 10-game mark is always, it's a cliche, but it's a good gauge. We're 1 game out now. It's really not looking good.
I still think, even though they won that day and it was a comeback win, the Forest game was a big problem because that was the obvious opportunity for a statement win. After a defeat at Tottenham, you're coming up against a team who had won one away game last season. They should have been winning that 3-0 or 4-0. What happens? They're 2-0 down after the first 4 minutes. And I suppose that day, it never felt like they were going to lose that game because there was so much time left to salvage it, and they did. And they did a good job of it. But it was a missed opportunity. And since then, there've been issues with every game, whether they've won, whether they've lost them in the Premier League. The only breeze, obviously, has been in the League Cup game against Palace, when Palace just, it seemed like, lulled United into a full sense of security so that they could beat them on Saturday, which is what happened. The weekend win, it just felt like a slightly better version of the Burnley win, in that United had more opportunities, they were more creative, they were more dominant on the ball. At Burnley had 60% possession, and it was, as I said, it was encouraging that they were patient with their play. They sensed that there would be more opportunities. They weren't they weren't getting concerned or rushing their play at all. And I think bringing Eriksson and Garnacho on into that environment helped an awful lot. It also helped an awful lot that Sheffield United's striker had caused quite a bit of hassle in the first half, went off in the second half, and that's what I mean. Like, in terms of the Man of the Match award, without wanting to fixate on it too much, it was given to someone who, for probably a third of that game, his day job was pretty simple because he didn't have anyone to really defend against to give him any hassle. I didn't think Maguire had a particularly good first half. There weren't many in the United show who had a good first half, and this is, unless they get 2 wins this week, I think, or there's a good performance and they avoid defeat in the derby, there's a very real risk that they're going to go back to square one again. The weekend game, it's a step in the right direction results-wise because they won. It's back-to-back wins in the Premier League, but you can't pull the wool over people's eyes. That performance, there were aspects of it that would have been disconcerting. And look, I think a lot of United fans want to give Ten Hag want to cut him a thick wedge of slack. Got there eventually, because the first season was so good, and it was, and nobody's saying that he's a big problem or the problem at all. But this is his team now, and
he's not blameless in what's
no,
going on.
No, he isn't, and it's still early days for some players, but I think those of us in here, we had reservations about certain signings, and I mean, Amrabat, he was popular on social media. It doesn't mean you're going to be good enough for Man United. What I've seen of him so far, he's not been good enough for Man United. And Casemiro, I think going into the Sheff United game, his absence wasn't a blow, but certainly the way they performed against Sheffield United, provided Casemiro is fit for the derby, which Ten Hag says he will be, you would probably still put him back in there. And do you put him in with Amrabat, or do you accommodate the midfielder you spent £60 million on in the summer, who's already been dropped? There were a couple of dilemmas already for Ten Hag that are directly on him because they are his players that he's signing. And even if they beat Copenhagen in a very comprehensive and crowd-pleasing way, a lot of people will dismiss it as it's only Copenhagen. You've got to be beating Copenhagen at home. So the real acid test this week, as vital as the Tuesday night game is, will obviously come on Sunday.
Tyrone, you know I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I'm going to give you a positive. Andrew Nona. Look, I'm not saying he was fantastic. I don't think he made any saves that he probably shouldn't have, but he was some good shot stopping efforts. Got there eventually myself there, tripping up my words. But no, I thought it was a competent overall performance, and he had a shaky first few weeks in the club, to say the least, a few howlers. So it was really important to have an assured display. He went the right way for McBurney's penalty. It was outstanding. It went in the back of that, yeah. But he needed that kind of performance, didn't he? It was a step in the right direction.
It was a solid performance. I mean, some of his saves were fairly unconventional. There was one in the first half, I think, where he almost got too strong a hand to it and knocked it back inside his 6-yard box. And I mean, there wasn't really a Sheffield United player on hand to capitalise on that. And maybe he knew that, and that's why he did it. But it's always a risk, kind of knocking it back central. There was the one, I think, second half where I don't think we actually got a replay, but he seemed to go the wrong way initially, and then we weren't sure whether the ball had been deflected or whether it was a huge swerve on it. I mean, maybe they showed a replay on Sky, and maybe it was a good save, but watching it live, it was like, that seemed a bit unconventional, because one of those shots that ends up in the middle of the goal and he's taken a step to the right. It certainly looked live like there must have been some swerve on it or something like that. But yeah, it was a competent performance. I think there was elements again where his distribution was a bit off for me.
I think that's because he's lost a bit of confidence.
I think it looks fairly obvious he's lost a bit of confidence. He's also not playing with the defence he expected, I guess, with distribution. I mean, I think Evans and Maguire are both pretty good on the ball, actually. I think it's an underrated element of probably both of their play, certainly Evans. But it was very different to the Brentford game. This time Onana could bring the ball out 20, 30 yards from goal and be stood alongside his centre-half. But there was a couple of times he did that and then went long and just overhit it or got the pass wrong and gifted possession back. So I didn't think his distribution was brilliant again. But yeah, it was, it was probably a 7 out of 10. It was a comfortable, competent performance from him. I guess he didn't have loads to do in the last half an hour. That was when United turned the screw and the spell in the game, and they did actually look reasonably good. But yeah, I think like you say, I mean, just having a game where he avoids an error at the moment is probably beneficial for him.
Were there any other positives from the performance? You guys?
They won.
They won. Fair enough.
Yeah. A very, very good goal that won the game. As I said, the impact of the subs, Eriksson and Garnacho.
Provided some impetus, didn't he, Garnacho off the bench?
It was a pity for him that he cocked up his opportunity. I think if he'd scored that, he'd probably got an 8 from me, because he also, the good thing about him is that even though he's still quite young, his use of the ball is improving. Like, there were times when I was talking about patient play, and it's very easy for someone that age to be impetuous and to overdo it or to make an error. I didn't really see him do much of that. The only error, the glaring error that he made, was when he was played through, and that might have been offside anyway. I mean, I don't know if it's a positive or a negative, but it's quite interesting how the supporters are reacting to Anthony Marshall these days. There were a lot of disgruntled fans when he came on for Højlund, because they appreciate Højlund's effort and they want him to do well. I could understand. I don't think it's particularly constructive in a way in that I can see what Ten Hag is doing there, and Højlund's got an injury, and let's face it, he's not scoring in the Premier League either, and he had 3 good chances at the weekend. It was another one of those games, a bit like the Palace one, where he's there for the chances, but he's not taken them again. But a lot of United fans just don't have any time for Anthony Marshall, and frankly, he didn't have any time for them at the end of the game, because he was the only one left on the pitch who went straight down the tunnel. We counted it at the end. The other 10 players had gone over to the supporters.
He's been in every match day squad, hasn't he? I think I'm right in saying that. Because we were discussing the injuries before the international break.
Maybe not Wolves, or maybe he was.
I think he was, which is, for Anthony Marshall, that's crazy, isn't it, really, when you think about it?
But again, the fact that he's only started in the League Cup, it says it all, really.
We said on the preview podcast, he's out of contract, isn't he, at the end of the season? There's obviously the option to extend his deal, but
they should just let him go. They should let him go and get a different forward in next summer. I think he's got 18 goals in the last 3, and including this one, 3 and a bit seasons for United, and that's a number 9. I mean, it's his best season in front of goal. A lot of those goals came behind closed doors games. So in terms of, is he a proper number 9? I mean, he's a number 9 in number only. It's in everyone's interest for him to leave next year, definitely.
We'll leave it there for part 2. We'll be back over for part 3.
Whether it's the legendary Lionesses, grassroots, or expert analysis of the women's leagues, Women's Football News has it all covered. A brand new monthly magazine packed with news, interviews, and expert opinion. Don't miss Women's Football News. Pick up a copy today from participating retailers. Women's football is here to stay, and so are we.
Welcome back to part 3 of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now, before we look ahead to Copenhagen, very briefly to end the podcast, just a quick mention to the Reach PLC's Football News magazine that's coming out on the 25th of this month. So if that's your kettle of fish, head across to the website, check that out with some exclusive interviews, etc. Some good content in that. Tyrone, back to Manchester United. Anyways, Copenhagen on Tuesday night in the Champions League, tomorrow night as we're recording. First time in the club's history, they lost 2 opening Champions League group games, Bayern Munich and Galatasaray, which means this game against Copenhagen is really a must-win.
Yeah, I think they've got to win both. They've got to win this double-header. Obviously, it's home against Copenhagen, then away at the Parken Stadium. I mean, even if they win both of those games and Galatasaray lose twice to Bayern, they'd only be 2 points ahead of Galatasaray going to Istanbul, and I think that's a scenario Galatasaray would probably have taken at the start of the group stage. And I mean, a lot could change before that game, but at the moment you'd have absolutely no faith in United even avoiding defeat away at Galatasaray, to be honest. I mean, you know, they struggled with the atmosphere at Bramall Lane. I don't think they're going to cope particularly well in Istanbul at the moment. So yeah, I think anything but 2 wins, and essentially it's over. It's done and dusted. So huge pressure going into it, really. it's typically United. They get back in the Champions League, and then within 2 months of the season starting, you're already thinking, well, they're going to be in the Europa League in the new year, and they're not going to qualify for the Champions League this year. I've said a few times previously on this podcast that it's almost like they're guests in this competition, rolling back the years at times. They can't qualify for it automatically year after year at the moment, and when they get in it, they're not really making an impact. The PSG game aside, you wouldn't say they've made a significant impact in the Champions League for a long, long time. So it's a huge, there's no doubt it's a huge game for them. They've got to find a way to win. They really should be beating Copenhagen, especially at home. But they've started okay in the group stage. Really, I mean they were 2-0 up in Istanbul with 4 minutes to go and drew 2-2. They took the lead against Bayern Munich at home, only lost 2-1. Winning goal there came after 83 minutes, I think. So they've pushed two teams who have beaten United pretty close. I went to Copenhagen last year with City, and that was 0-0. City had a man sent off after half an hour, so a bit of a different game. But it's very loud there. It's a really good atmosphere, and they look a pretty competent team. So I don't think it'll be a walk in the park for United, but certainly on Tuesday night they have got no excuses other than winning. I mean, if they fail to win, and we're saying after 3 games they're basically out, I think that'd be absolutely disastrous.
It is a disaster. That would be a disaster. Any changes for the game? I know we kind of talked about Garnacho having a good impact off the bench, but it seems quite unrealistic to see him starting over Rashford. I mean, you'd probably drop Anthony, but you're going to play Mount on the right. There's a few dilemmas going on. But what would you do going into the game?
Varane, I think. Probably Varane for
Evans.
obvious
one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Varane and Maguire. With Martinez out, Varane and Maguire would be the first choice defence at the moment going forward. I think I'd probably bring Mount back in. Eriksen did quite well from the bench on Saturday, but Eriksen's had an impact from the bench a few times actually this season, I think. So I'd keep him on the bench. I think McTominay probably deserved to keep his place after what he did against Brentford.
Does he deserve to keep it for Copenhagen?
I don't think so. We were talking on the way down on Saturday, and how I said on the podcast when Samuel was away, and he was saying that he agreed that McTominay's the type of player Ferguson would always have found space in the squad for. But you can also imagine that even after what he did against Brentford, Fergie wouldn't have started him at Sheffield United necessarily. So I think that time is gone now. He's a very valuable squad player. There's certainly games you'd be looking at 3-4 weeks in advance where you'd be like, you're starting that one, you're in for that one. Newcastle, I think you'd have him in the team for sure. But I would bring Mount back in. So I think there are 2 changes. I can't see him not playing Anthony. He plays him every time, doesn't he? He's almost got to play him, given the money he spent on him. So I don't think there's any chance of Ten Hag ever dropping Anthony, to be honest. I wouldn't drop Rashford either. I think he did all right on Saturday. I think he was better than he has been. So yeah, maybe those 2 changes. Maybe that'll be it. Reguilon's a bit of a strange one. He
should get an update on him today, shouldn't we?
Yeah, and obviously with everything that was going on Saturday, it was kind of it was well down the list of issues and things to ask. But he played against Barnsley in the behind closed doors game in midweek previously at the start of the international break. He trained. Ten Hag confirmed on Friday he'd been training, and then suddenly he wasn't in the matchday squad. So don't know what's happened there. I mean, if he's fit, I'd have him in the team for sure. But obviously we'll wait and see what the update is with that.
Finally, there's an interesting subplot because Rasmus Højlund's brothers. He could be both play for Copenhagen. It's doubtful that all 3 of them are going to be at the pitch at the same time, but it's interesting nonetheless, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a slim possibility. 2 18-year-old twins, 23 months younger than Rasmus. So having one child, I pity his mum and dad. That must have been a hell of an effort. Although they have been awarded with 3 professional footballers, so I'm sure
it's not a bad return.
They're going to make the most of it now. So yeah, Oscar is. Like I said, they're both 18. Oscar's in the squad most days now. I don't know if he did start at the weekend, but someone I spoke to in Denmark said he might have started that league game at the weekend. He has started for them. He's been on the bench in both Champions League games. I think he's come on in 1, maybe both. So he's kind of on the fringes of the first team, and I think will be on the bench at the very least. Emil is more likely to play in the youth league. He has played this season. I think he made his debut on the opening day of the season. When him and Oscar played, he was on the bench in some of the Champions League qualifiers. So, it's not beyond the realms of possibility if there was a few injuries that, they'd both be in the squad, either here or in Copenhagen. And we were talking about it, and I've done a piece this morning on them, speaking to their coached at their first club, and some quite nice background on the family dynamics and stuff. And I can't recall a scenario where 3 brothers have played in the same Champions League game ever. So, you know, that would be very interesting if it happens.
Some good genes in the Highland family.
There are some good genes, aren't there? Well, I think his dad was a footballer in Denmark, not at this level, but I think he had a okay career. The mum's
just on about their wardrobe choices, actually. I wasn't on about that as well, if you want.
some cracking genes.
We'll leave it there then for part 3. Tyrone, thanks for your time.
No problem. Thank you, Stephen.
And thanks for listening as usual. Have a good week and take care.